No, el señor este mayor ha visto cuando antes
Realmente no vengo por ser Mario, vengo como
come representing the Defense Joint Command. The reason for coming here is to let you know what we do in our unit. Everybody knows about about what defense unit does. Everybody knows what a fighter is, submarine, etc. But right now, the chief head of state has created this cyber defense unit with a joint command that's in charge of it.
Funciona el mando. Bueno, comenzaremos con una...
I'd like to begin with a description of cyberspace, which is the place where a war scenario takes place. We have the first domain, which is when countries or units start fighting on land. Then we have the sea and river units, and then a fifth, the First World War. In World War I, we see that planes start being used. After this, we have a fifth domain, NATO, etc. And missiles, etc., and all these new things. But right now, the armed forces realized that not enough attention was being paid to security within the devices that had been connected in networks, because we mustn't forget that all the networks emerged thanks to military initiative. For instance, the networks that you use to connect yourselves or to communicate amongst yourselves. And in Spain, we created a defense joint command in 2013 before NATO recognized the existence of the fifth domain and operations inside the fifth domain. This means that according to Article 5 in the treaty that we signed, an aggression, an attack in cyberspace would be like an attack in space. So it is clear how important this is for NATO. And from 2018 onwards, a new specific unit was created in order to give service to army. And within military operations, we have many devices that are interconnected. I'm sure you've seen drones flying. Soldiers on land are also interconnected through the net. And we come to a scenario similar to the one you can see here. Lots of support, lots of control of the situation, lots of information. The rest of the domains depend on the security, and an interruption of communications may represent an important blow to the enemy. So therefore, it's fundamental to ensure communications and to be able to interrupt communications of the enemy. And this is an addition to classical intelligence, because with a very low risk, it allows to obtain a large amount of information without officers' exposure. We all know that the three basic pillars of cybersecurity are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so all this, so information may be sequestered. Information sequestering is not that important because we may have backups, but for a company it is a problem to lose information. Breaking into information or having information stolen and having them exposed in WikiLeaks, the impact on social level is very high. And apart from this, there's the possibility of having military projects stolen. And this means losing millions of euros in research for the company, for example, a shipyard that's building ships for the military. And also from the point of view of the military, this is also a very serious problem. And also information that is stolen in order for it to be sold. And people steal information from a country and sells it to another country. So there's also an economic motivation, and there are also ethnic, religious reasons that may lead to information theft. And there's also a possibility of destroying stored information. This is also very dangerous for the military sector. For instance, if the database where all the blood groups are stolen, for instance, from a blood bank, all this information is also important. And then there's information destruction, and this also entails an important cost regarding how much it's going to cost to retrieve all that information. Some and like we know from the previous slide, looking at all the macro network of operations, if you can attack the availability of the network that interconnect all these military systems, this also represents a very important drawback. This is not accessible to everybody because normally we know we need very expensive equipment. This is available for countries. This is why I'm showing this transparency. This is a representation of what the cyber threat triangle is about, and the rest of the presentation will be based on this drawing. In the end, this is a risk analysis, assets that you may have, whether they be networks or information, and who will attack these assets. In the end, there will be people, groups of people who, for whichever reason, will try to exploit your vulnerabilities. So, according to whether people are more interested in objectives, actors will change depending on what it is they look for. Money or information or industrial patents, and actors will change, so will motivation, and vulnerabilities may be intrinsic. For instance, budgets assigned to by defense ministries can also be violated. If one has the same server that one may find in a company, is relatively simple for a hacker to know what your system is like, or that you have that system in your database or server, And at a given moment, what they will do is to try and find vulnerabilities, and they may consider developing an exploit. And if it was like years ago when there was a huge budget and when equipment were different to what you found on the street, right now we have the same web server than the Bank of Santander has. It just depends on how good your staff is when it comes to doing the patching. The main stakeholders, the main actors we have in the cyber world, or our enemies, would be cyber criminals. This affects civilians, companies, hacktivists. This is a term that came up mixing the terms hackers and activists. These are people that live in these social networks, and not only they say what they want to say, but they also produce attacks. And then there's state agents, things that everybody is thinking of when they think of CIA or whatever, and then groups that are paid by states in order to try and we are known as APTs, that is companies that are set up in order to obtain information about possible interests of their contractors. And in this case, what they do is to devote all their efforts to obtain information about the targets and then to exploit that information for as long as possible. This is a very high risk for the state, and what they want is to steal information. And then insiders, like the example I gave you before, and people like Snowden, people inside a corporation who all of a sudden start going against it, and they produce huge harm because, first of all, they're inside the network and all the security measures have no effect, and especially if they are practitioners and know what to do in order to damage the network. Sometimes people are made redundant, and all of a sudden they may want revenge. They may leave behind a logic bomb and in order to extract information remotely. Another classical thing in all presentations is what cyberspace is, but from the point of view of users. Users surf the net, and we see that they're indexed. We have Google, all the information in Wikipedia, we have Chinese search engines. Everything that's indexed represents 30% of all the services connected to internet. Under the water, we have the deep web. These are services connected to internet you cannot index because they are protected by a user and a password. An example is the accounts in the banks of people that you must log, or else you cannot access. And then beneath this, we have the dark web. You can access like Tor encrypted services, for instance, and what they use and used for reporting on criminal activities, pedophilia, etc. And the cyber criminals, their main motivation is basically money. So what could happen? Somebody who you think is not a risk, for instance, for the Ministry of Defense, somebody who just wants money shouldn't be, for instance, or somebody who works as a mercenary. So the country that has you sets up an intermediate barrier. Cybercrime is people make lots of money. In 2015, it was said that cybercrime was more profitable than drug dealing. So that more and more countries in Eastern Europe with their mafias are moving their business towards cybercrime, because going into a bank with a gun doesn't produce much profit, but doing cybercrime is much more profitable, as you can imagine. And you can do it remotely, and then TTPs. Massive phishing. Once you find an attacker, what you need to do is to model that attacker. How do they work? If you can define a profile of the attacker, you can try and have an idea of who is attacking you, because normally the defense is reactive. Normally you've been attacked first, you find out you've been attacked, and you try and find out what's happened. So what we try and do is to model the attacker. So if you know that you're the Bank of Santander and there's people who are going to try and rob you, you need to protect yourself against those techniques used by the attacker. In our case, we must be protected against powerful organized groups who try and let themselves in the defense ministry. They can buy exploits in the black market. You need to have a much greater security level than an SME, for instance. You need to invest a lot of money in defense, and you need to obtain the commitment indicators. Cyber criminals, what they do normally is to go in through emails aimed at potential victims. The more targeted the email is, the more credible it is going to be for people to click on it and type their bank account password, for instance. So there's a whole, for instance, people will send you a weekly or monthly report with a summary of a bunch of events, arms, whatever information. This mail comes, it looks like a summary from the NATO or news agents or whatever. So you open it up, and there's an exploit that infects the machine. The attacker has done his homework and did a good characterization of the victim systems. If they know the operating system and the or PowerPoint, for instance, they can just go in and they'll try to connect the server and keep downloading things. In the case of home cyber criminals, probably all they're going to do is to download a whole bunch of packages and they want to stay many years in your network, but in the end, the procedures are the same. The only thing is that techniques, people who are attacking us, since they have money, they buy exploits. They go to the black market and buy them. And they have an ability to purchase, to buy. For instance, some of these systems cost $200,000. You go into a high executive's phone and steal their WhatsApps, their messages. You can blackmail them and do horrible things. Hacktivists. With what happened in Catalonia, all the campaign in the internet, they've been writing in Twitter, and also they can do service denial at different targets they considered interesting for them. See these activities when tension goes up, the level of ethnic and religious conflicts. People become polarized, and all of a sudden, what they do is to organize campaigns through Facebook and Twitter that are open in order to have a greater audience, and what they do is to allow a bunch of people to join them. In the case of anonymous ones, they use tools like Lloyd, and they do distributed service denial. Somebody who's a bit more enthusiastic, what they will try to do is to do a bot in order to attack the targets they want to attack. Normally, activists don't have money to do this. A botnet such as certain or some of them huge attacks. There's a different type of attack. These networks you can buy, and you can buy or pay according to the amount of infected equipment, and if you pay in bitcoins, you have an absolute transparency.
Pagas en bitcoins y te montas una red sin tener otro tipo de
a network in order to have some type of infrastructure. Within the profiles of activists, you have Steppenwolves, lone wolves. Here you may be terrorists who may be linked to ISIS, for instance, and maybe somebody who's a black hack and who, for whichever reason, decide to do something. The normal thing is for activists to work in groups. These activists are very hard to detect because they do not deploy their campaigns in areas that are controlled by state security corps. Security forces and security corps normally study and focus on a certain type of users, and this entails an economic cost and a human cost. Please don't think that they watch every single thing everybody writes on Twitter. You may use keywords, and you may see, well, these terms have shown up I don't know how many times. And you need to learn whatever language is being used.
Como os comentaba, los activistas lo que buscan es
So activists look for publicity in their actions. A group like Anonymous try to become notorious. If they can do defacement or spy on a website for 5 minutes, that's what they are after. From the state's perspective, this is only damage to the image. For example, if a ministry's website is hacked, or, for example, the Twitter account of US10 were stolen, and they really damaged their image. So it's nothing further than becoming ridiculous. Well, it can cost somebody their job, for example, but it's not a state-level defense matter. When I was talking about the botnets, is that you can control them. For example, the operation in Catalonia, well, they weren't able to find supporters to perform massive attacks. However, if you pay people for generating 600 gigabytes per second, that is unbearable. And in these cases, the economic damage has its consequences, of course. Well, then we have the attackers with the state support. These are our greatest concern. They have time and they have money. Usually, attackers have the time advantage. That is, they can attack whenever they want and when they feel ready. However, you need to be on alert 24 hours in order to avoid threats. They can map your networks, map your users, they can prepare phishing emails, they can try to introduce a bug, they can map your network. You are always on the defensive. So these are people who have money, who have time, and all the APTs that big corporations, for example, McAfee, Symantec, or Kaspersky have and publish, they publish reports on different campaigns carried out by the same groups of people using different names. But what they leave behind is a fingerprint. Sometimes they want you to know that it was them, and well, that allows you to characterize them. So they usually change their tactics, but the techniques are usually the same, and the entrance vector is generally the phishing vector. They've also adapted themselves to defensive measures. If you know a little bit about how defensive devices have evolved and what probabilistic detection is, well, they know that in the past, when you characterized a network, you could say, well, a computer that is encoding information on a Saturday at 4 a.m. is malicious. Why? Because nobody is working on a public building at the time and on that day. So if the computer is connected on a Saturday night, that is totally abnormal. And if they extract gigabytes of information, that is a clear attack. And the consequences of that attack cannot be seen until the Monday after. Therefore, you need a 24/7 monitoring service in order to monitor 24/7 that something is going on. So when the attackers realize that they cannot connect and extract that information, they decide to change their tactics. And they decide to attack during the daytime and extract smaller amounts of information. So in the daytime, when people access, for example, sports websites or food websites, well, that traffic can be masked. If your detection system is good enough, you'll be able to find out that the connections take place in China or Russia or other foreign countries. But still, when they realize that you are controlling certain IP addresses, they are going to use all the tactics. For example, now we're using Dropbox accounts. Then you close accounts, but they will try something else. So they always find the way to access the information. That's why this last point is important. In 2012, the window for filtering information, the deadline was 416 days. This figure has gone down with time, but these are the days when they can steal documents or reports or anything from you. Well, this is partly due to the fact that the expenditure on defense has increased as well. So then we have the insiders. They work in the organization. They are hard to detect because if they are administrators or if they have privileges inside the company, for example, accessing the data servers, or sometimes they can access paper files, well, they are internal threats. And the only way of detecting these threats is not only publishing it on social media. You need to be alert to anomalous situations at work in order to detect these people fighting back. In the Manning's case, this was discovered because this guy thought that the U.S. practices in Abu Ghraib were unethical, and the same with Snowden, that filtered information that thought was dangerous for the U.S. population. So if this happens in a company, they will probably fire their IT department and end up outsourcing the service. So we need to be alert to these things and try to prevent attacks from happening. A way of finding out about malicious activities is the use of honeypots or honey nets. A honeypot is what it is, a pot full of honey, a decoy. That is a group of servers with marked or labeled information. This is, you use true and false information in the same document, and if you see that the information has been filtered to the press, for example, and you see that the fake news came up, you can discover how it was filtered. You can deny the authorship of the document, and at the same time you can put up an infected PDF file, for example, for them to download. So this way you can characterize which user in the network pulled out the files. I underline the term user. Why? Because in digital investigations, it's important to say that this was done by a user through an equipment, through a machine. The authorship, the who of the criminal investigations is more complicated in the cyber world. This picture helps us understand a little bit better what I have just said. If the criminals are on the left and they attack massively, they are only interested in money. So the bigger the ransomware campaign, the better. The more infected people, the more money for them. However, on the other end of the arrow, we have the insiders. The insiders have a very precise target. They are going to attack their company only. Then you can trust your allies, and for example, if you are from NATO, you can discard a number of nations that want to attack you. Then we have competitors. If you are Samsung, for instance, you can suspect that IBM or other IT companies are trying to find out secrets against you. Then we have criminal hackers that look for money and sell their services to the mafia and also to foreign nations. For example, a person who's unemployed and who knows some hacker to help them out, that could be in a scenario. That could be a scenario too, but mostly their services are provided to mafia groups that pay very good salaries, by the way. Now we have the network defense based on intelligence. This is as follows. If you're able to find out information about what's going on in your networks in terms of security, you have to implement that as a defensive measure. If you find anomalous traffic, you must be able to characterize it and create a rule so that that detection capability turns into something physical, so that with that rule you can prevent things from happening. If you have advanced methods, you can only you can not only detect but also prevent. However, there are always analysts behind the attacks, and no machine will ever outperform an analyst in his capacity of telling if there is a false positive or a real case. If you let machines to control the total network traffic, you would probably be in a mess. Now, going back to attackers, APTs will try to deceive you time and time again. What's common in large corporations is that they buy IOCs, indicators of commitment. Why? Because it's difficult for you to characterize all threats or have a global vision of the entire system. For example, a provider such as Symantec has more than 20,000 probes all over the world, whereas in your company you're only able to see what is happening in your company. But if your probes are everywhere, you know that an attack taking place in Taiwan may come to Europe in a couple of days because this is a global issue. So if a file, an infected file, can be exported very easily. Everybody works with the same hardware, with the same operating systems. So the victim operating systems may be victims also in the other corner of the world. So if you target your attacks, or if you target your defense, you will be better off because you know what's happening to you and what's happening to others. A recommendation is not to buy that kind of information from many different providers. If you compare the information between 3 or 4 companies, most of the results will match. They have agreements among themselves to share signatures. So the hashes are interchangeable and the companies exchange them. Here we're talking about detection beyond the hash. We're talking about behavior, network connections that can be inside the files. The companies are competitors and they create more advanced devices, more advanced than the hash themselves. So I can find out what they are doing, the login used in Windows, for example. If all that information is used as a signature inside the malware, that costs a lot of money because it requires a great amount of time for research, and not all the companies can afford that. We are the state, and we have a dedicated person. We have a malware investigation department, and what we do is to characterize our information, but we complete that with external information, because if you are too focused on what is happening in your network only, you won't be aware of what is going on elsewhere. So instead of an external provider, we use our own providers with a MIS platform that is used for the exchange of IOCs. And if that source is trustworthy, it is very useful. But if you are only interested in your own business and you don't want to share your IOCs or your results, then you are worse off with respect to your competitors. IOCs are indicators of compromise. They may be atomic, that is tiny, very small, undividable malware. They can be computed. For example, the hash. I have the hash of a file and I have the signature, and I can easily define it as malware. They won't be 2 files having the same hash. Some attackers know that you can detect their hashes, so what they do is make small modifications in the code in order to release different bugs. And other ones use diffuse logic which look for blocks instead of performing a global search. And if there are partial coincidence, there are chances that that file is indeed infected. Then there is the behavior. If there is a process that always connects to the same IP address, we can identify that at least it belongs to the same family. And we can also detect the mode of operation. It's easy to find that they come from either Russia, China, or North Korea, which are the countries that typically hit European business. This is the MITRE system developed by a U.S. company. F-35 is one of its most ambitious and well-known projects, and sadly it became famous because a supposedly Chinese operation got into their networks for many years. For many years, they were using their servers and they were drawing information from the F-35 project. So the Chinese were able to copy all that technology. They weren't able to clone the turbines, but many of the F-35 features were copied by the Chinese, who saved millions of euros. Their planes are only defensive, but they are very good combat planes anyway. So they learned from the plane, and they from this example, and they decided to create their own department. That's how they came up with this modeling. And we've all used it because it's very good. An attack starts with a recognition phase, trying to look for targets, the operating systems they have, etc. And then they go to the weaponization. That is, I need to find a weapon against it. I need to find a medium for infection, whether it is an email, a flash drive, something that can be downloaded from the internet, a fake access point. Well, you need to find your way. Then the next phase is the exploitation phase, remote control, execution, and maintenance. People try to maintain the persistence, as I explained before. And against that model, we have the reverse method, the intrusion kill chain. We use the attacker's vulnerabilities in order to get him. So the sooner you can get them, the less the damage. So it's important to start detecting that they are downloading packages from suspicious IPs, or finding out computers that are compromised in the network. You can find out how long they've been in your system, etc. But in order to be agile in this, you need to move as fast as possible to the delivery phase so that they don't get inside your organization. In the ideal world, you would need to get them in the recognition phase, having people going into fora, detecting information about exploits, because if you find out that they are trying to exchange that information, you can react promptly and patch your vulnerabilities. Another way of modeling this is this one from the Hans Institute. It is the so-called diamond model. It is similar to the former one, but it adds the social political ring. For example, with the Catalonian issue, there is another thing to be borne in mind, which is the social context. And to wrap up, this is the cycle for event management. First, we detect the event, we respond promptly, and we analyze the intrusion. It has to cover the planification phase. to be effective. If there is no planning, the rest of the chain is worthless. So this is a chain that needs to cover each and every step. Here we have a flow chart showing how the operations center and the research units exchange information for detection, so that they feed the detection capability and benefits the organization from the defensive perspective. In our case, we work this way, and in our operations center, we need people, everything updated, the probes set up, and if you want to have your staff working 24/7 or not, that's up to you. You have to train your personnel and have or make them capable of detecting the alerts. And that was all for me. If you have any questions.
Muchas gracias.